Hi, I'm Linda, and today I want to talk to you about a simple technique that oftentimes is asked for you to do if you're doing any type of garment sewing or maybe even some home decor sewing, and that is gathering. That one little word can actually represent an awful lot of work on your part. I'm going to show you first on a thin piece of fabric, and then I'm going to give you a tip on how to do gathering on fabric that might be a little bit more difficult to gather. So I'm going to begin with a strip of fabric, and the important thing is that I'm going to be doing 2 rows of parallel stitching close to this edge. Now, if you have a serger or you want to, you can overcast this edge, because what we're going to be doing when we gather it is actually kind of abrading that fabric, which can cause it to fray. But we're just doing this as a sample, which I kind of recommend too, just so that you can make sure that your machine is set up well. So I'm starting off with lowering my presser foot, and what I'm going to be doing here is starting very close to the edge of my fabric. Now, sometimes what will happen is you might need to gather within the body of some fabric, meaning that you might be going all the way around in a circle. And there are some tips for that, which is basically start at the edge or the seam of the fabric, because this way then you'll have a place where you can kind of hide where the gathering may not be perfect. Now, the machine that I'm working on has a drop-in bobbin, and this is tip number 1. Make sure that before you start stitching, you've got enough thread on that bobbin so that you can do a lot of long stitching without running out of the thread, because that is a frustration nobody wants to go through. Now, my bobbin also is the type that actually has you cut your thread off in the bottom, and I need that bobbin thread to come up. So the first thing I'm going to do is take a couple stitches, and then I'm going to stop and bring my 2 threads to the top. And so now you can see I have both my top thread and my bobbin thread to the top, and any of that little bit of stitching that I have here, well, I'm just going to pull it up and out of the way so that I can start all over again. And so the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to set my machine to stitch in the left needle position. So what that means is if your machine has the ability to move the needle over all the way to the left, I recommend it. Most patterns will have a seam allowance, meaning that they will tell you how much room you have at the top that might get incorporated into a seam. So whether it's 5/8 of an inch or 1/2 of an inch, just be sure that your 2 rows of stitching are to the right side of that seam allowance, so that you don't have any chance of those stitches showing through when you put your final piece together. So I'm starting close to the edge, and what I'm going to do next is I'm going to make sure that my stitch length is as long as my machine will allow. And for my machine, that's 5 millimeters in stitch length. Now let's begin by stitching. Okay, when I get all the way to the end, be mindful of this. If you're lucky enough to have a machine that has the ability to cut your threads, don't use it when you get to the end, because you'll have to rip that stitching out and start all over. What you'll do instead is make sure your needle is out of the fabric, and then what I'm going to do is just pull a long thread all the way to the end, so that what I have at the beginning and the end is a nice generous length of thread. All right, now I'm ready to do my next row of stitching. And on my machine, what I can simply do is move my needle position over to the right. That looks good. I'm going to now stitch my second row of stitching, also close to the edge, making sure that I'm not super close to that first row. Okay, so now I've got thread tails on both sides, and you probably remember that this is the top of my stitching, and underneath is where my bobbin thread is. Well, bobbin thread is the easiest one to pull up for gathering. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a little pin here, and I'm going to coax my needle threads that are on the top. I'm going to bring them to the back on one side, and I'm going to do that for each row of my stitching. So now I have all 4 of my threads pulled to the back, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to group all of those threads together, and I'm going to tie them in a knot so that when I gather my fabric, that those gathers don't slip off of the opposite end. Now, if you're working on gathering potentially like the top of a skirt, and remember I had talked about like if you had pieces of fabric joined together, you would do this on one side and you'd be able to gather your stitching all the way around. Sometimes when you're working on something big like that, it's a good idea to use both sides and keep them free, gather from each end, and then what you can do is tie the ends. But once you've started practicing or kind of doing a lot of gathering, what you'll notice is that you kind of come to those same conclusions. So now I'm just lifting up and grabbing just my bobbin thread, keeping my top thread to the top, and I'm going to hold on to these firmly, and now all I have to do is take my fingers and I am just going to coax that fabric down here, and what it's going to do is it's going to collect. So I'm just going to continue holding on to my threads and pulling my fabric down, and just be careful so that you don't pull this. Like if you get any resistance as you're trying to coax the fabric down here, don't tug too hard. And also, this is a good time to look at the type of thread that you're using. I really recommend 100% polyester. Don't get old thread out for this, because if your thread pops or breaks, you're starting all over again. Now remember at the beginning I had mentioned that if you had a serger or you had the ability to do like an overcasting stitch, wouldn't be a bad idea to do it at the top. Granted, this is a short piece of fabric. I haven't really messed around with it a whole lot, but you can already see that I'm getting some raveling here. Traditionally, if you're going to be gathering, you know that what you're doing is you're going to be making your fabric fit into a set space, meaning that if you're gathering a strip of fabric, maybe you need it to fit into 6 inches of fabric. And what you would do traditionally is you would maybe mark the center of your fabric or mark different registration points along the way so that you can evenly distribute. But if you watch me, since I've got all of this extra thread here, because I've already been gathering it up, you can just as easily loosen things up. And once you've made it tight and you start loosening it, things start kind of moving around in that area a lot easier. Now, this is a perfect technique to do on a lightweight piece of fabric, and depending upon what the fiber is that you're working on, you may find that you get nice little pretty stacks of little pleats here, or you might find that your fabric is just way too thick. For example, if I take a double layer of this fabric, so what I have here is the same fabric I was just using, which the gathering worked perfectly on it as a single layer. But what if I was doing the edge of a pillow and I want to do a ruffle around it and I wanted a nice folded edge? I have to tell you from experience, gathering fabric when you have 2 layers, or if the fabric itself is a lot stiffer, it is not an easy thing to do when you're trying to pull 2 parallel rows. So I have a little tip for you instead. This is some crochet cotton, and you can actually find all kinds of different lightweight yarn, if you will, or crocheting thread. And you can find this at all kinds of crafts and specialty stores. And what I'm looking for is something that's not too thick, because what I'm going to show you next is how you can zigzag over this cord actually as you're stitching down this piece of fabric, and that's going to give you a really easy way to pull up your gathering stitches. So the first thing I'm going to do is select a zigzag stitch. For me, it's my stitch number 5. Now, if you're an experienced sewer, you may realize that you have the ability to adjust the width of your stitch, meaning how wide that needle is going to swing back and forth. And for me, I can tell you that what I want to do is I want to change that stitch width and make it as wide as I can. For my machine, it's going to be at the 6.0 level. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take a little bit of that cord and I'm just going to unravel it so that it's not hanging up on me. And I'm going to slide my fabric underneath my presser foot and then lower it. Now, the next thing I have to address is what's my stitch length. Stitch length is how close my stitches are together. My machine comes in at default of 1.4. Let's just go with that and see how it looks. Now when I get started stitching, what I want to do is anchor my stitches, meaning I want to make sure that these stitches are not going to come out easily. So I'm just going to do a few little stitches here. And now I'm going to reverse stitch over what I just stitched. Because in this instance, I want to lock those stitches in place. So now notice I'm holding the edge of my fabric against the edge of my presser foot. And the next thing I'm going to do is just lay this cording kind of in the center. Now my presser foot has a little notch on the toe of the foot that's in the center, and I'm just going to sew down. Now I can see already I want to open up my stitch length, so I'm going to make it, let's try 2.5. So the thing that I'm paying attention to is I don't want my stitching at any time to pierce this piece of cord on top. If I do, I have to start all over. So I'm paying attention and keeping that in the center of my foot. I just anchored my stitching at the end, and this time I can actually use the trimming function on my machine. So see what I've done? I've zigzagged over that cording. And now what I can do is I can gather my fabric very easily, and this time I won't really have to worry too much about anything coming out because I have the ability to pull my cord from either direction. I don't want my stitching threads to get caught in it, and there you go. In fact, I'd say that that's probably faster than the other technique, but you want to relegate this to a type of fabric that might be really thick or a couple layers, but it does a very nice job as well. So I hope that you've enjoyed these tips for gathering, and I hope that your project turns out well. Thank you very much, and if you're looking for more inspiration, check out babylock.com. We've got a lot more there too.